First, we turn our attention to Nadira Hill, who is a PhD candidate, and not, as I proleptically and with great faith anticipated, not yet Dr. Hill, but a PhD candidate in the Interdepartmental Program in Classical Art and Archaeology at the University of Michigan. Her dissertation examines drinking and dining practices in late classical Greece. And over the last year, Nadira has been interested in learning and talking more about pedagogy. She's been an instructional aide for her department, consulting and collaborating with graduate student and faculty instructors on the transition from in-person to online instruction. And she completed a seminar on community-based learning, and she continues to educate herself about equitable and anti-racist pedagogical techniques by attending talks and workshops in her free time. In December, she also started a blog to share her experiences as a Black student in classics and amplify the work and voices of other BIPOC in the discipline. You can now follow the blog at Apotheke Blog on both Twitter and Instagram, and I'll be posting these in the chat area afterwards, so I won't spell them out. And today she will highlight the contributions of a lack of systematic pedagogical training in higher education to inequitable, racist, and overall toxic environments for students in classics. Feel free to live tweet or talk on Twitter using the handle @NadiraWho. And I'll post that as well. Please welcome Nadira Hill. The call is coming from inside the house, addressing the impacts of inadequate teacher training in classics. Thank you, Nadira.
Great. I will try to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Nadira Hill. I use she, her pronouns. And for those who may not be able to see me, I am a Black woman with curly black hair, and I am wearing a black turtleneck. If you'd like to follow along with my talk, you can find the link in the chat, and slides can also be found there. Before I begin, I want to warn everyone that I will be talking about some media, events, and experiences relating specifically to racism that may be triggering to some people, particularly in the first half of my talk. I want to thank Hannah and Joe for organizing this conference, and I look forward to continuing to learn from my fellow presenters today. I'd also like to thank every single person who contributed to the Google survey that I had originally circulated on Twitter a few weeks ago in connection with this talk. In light of the increase in instances of hate crimes committed against Asian and Asian American communities in the last year in connection with the pandemic, culminating in the murders of 6 Asian women in Atlanta this week, I think it's more important now than ever to remind everyone that you can't be selectively anti-racist. While I am only equipped to speak from my own experience as a Black woman in the discipline, the racism and sexism that I have experienced might look different from what my colleagues of color have experienced, but it is still racism and sexism. Anti-Asian racism and sexism still requires the kind of unlearning and active dismantling of white supremacy that we so often call for in response to anti-Black racism and sexism. Although I inevitably decided not to use any of the submissions from the survey I circulated or shared due to some complications involved in conducting research using human subjects, I recognize and deeply appreciate your courage to speak out, even if just to me, about racist or otherwise offensive behavior that you have personally experienced or witnessed in your classrooms, departments, and institutions. Your responses have given me the courage to speak about my own experiences today. To begin, in a New York Times article published last month, the New York Times article featuring Dr. Daniel Padilla-Peralta, these words stood out to me. Quote, Padilla sensed that his pursuit of classics had displaced other parts of his identity, just as classics in Western civilization had displaced other cultures and forms of knowledge. Recovering them would be essential to dismantling the white supremacist framework in which both he and classics had become trapped. End quote. These words stood out to me because I realized after some reflection on my experience as a student of classics that for most of my academic career, I had been a black sheep, no pun intended, in a sea of white, shepherded along by well-meaning advisors whose guidance led me to believe that so long as I crossed my T's and dotted my I's, or memorized my paradigms and participated in archaeological fieldwork, and see here a photo from my very first trench in my very first season 7 years ago, I would continue to fit in just fine in the discipline. Like others in classics who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, I didn't really notice how much I stood out as usually the only non-white person in my courses for most of my undergraduate career, and even a few of my graduate ones. My own personal narrative was, like Padilla Peralta's, displaced by a desperate need not only to fit in, but to excel as a student of classics and archaeology. As I was looking for a photo to use in this presentation, I wondered how much of my blindness to my own difference was due to the fact that my experience in classics was only a microcosm of what I'd experienced my entire time in college. I went to a predominantly white institution in a very small town in Virginia and was a member of a predominantly white sorority for several years. Possibly because of this experience, I didn't really recognize my own difference until my senior year, when I had to confront it head on and think about how to talk about my identity in my graduate school applications. I knew I was Black, but I didn't see it as my defining characteristic. I didn't really identify with it. I didn't notice it even when I felt particularly moved by one professor's choice to show us Spike Lee's film Chirac in a course on the works of Aristophanes, still one of my favorite courses in undergrad and one of my favorite films, which was in sharp contrast to the more traditional assignments centered around the likes of 300 and Troy. I see more clearly now why watching Chirac was so important to me. It was because for the first time, I was seeing people like me engaging with classics. Unfortunately, this would be the only time that I experienced such a thoughtful pedagogical choice as a student. And here, at this point, I want to alert everyone before I move on to the next slide that there will be an image from the film 300 of Xerxes. And while I will also be talking about blackface at this time, there will be no images of this in my presentation. The uncritical use of film clips that include obviously racist tropes, either intentionally, as in the case of the use of blackface in Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra, or unintentionally, as with this portrayal of Xerxes by Rodrigo Santoro in 300, is particularly harmful to both students and instructors of color in our discipline. The second example is even more egregious when you consider the fact that I've been tasked with discussing the film 300 multiple times throughout my academic career, in both written form and as a leader of discussion sections. And in none of these instances were its problematic elements addressed by the lead instructor. I will admit that I myself failed as an instructor when I didn't take it upon myself to point out those elements to my students after stills from the film were used in lecture to highlight the difference between Greeks and barbarians. But I think this example points to two main reasons for this.